The studio boss slammed his revolver on the oak desk hard enough that the ashtray jumped, and every producer in that room went dead silent. Wait, because what John Wayne said in the next 15 seconds would either kill the entire production or turn him into the most untouchable man in Hollywood, and not one person in that office saw it coming. The gun sat there between them like a rattlesnake coiled on warm rock, chrome catching the afternoon light coming through the Venetian blinds. John Wayne stood on the opposite side of that desk in the same leather vest and dusty boots he'd walked off the set in 20 minutes earlier, and his face showed about as much emotion as the wooden Indian outside the cigar shop on Sunset. The backer, a thick-necked man named Vincent Cullaro, who'd made his fortune in Chicago before moving west into pictures, had both palms flat on the desk now, leaning forward, breathing hard enough that his collar looked tight. 3 producers in expensive suits had frozen mid-reach for their coffee cups, and the studio lawyer in the corner had gone pale as typing paper. The meeting had been scheduled for 3 o'clock, neutral territory, executive conference room on the 5th floor of Continental Pictures. John had known it was coming. They all had. The production was 3 weeks over schedule and $250,000 over budget, and Cullaro's money was the only thing keeping the cameras rolling. But nobody had expected him to walk in carrying a piece. "You think I'm playing?" Cullaro's voice came out rough like gravel being poured. "You think this is some kind of negotiation?" John didn't move, didn't blink, just looked at the man the way you'd look at a horse that's thinking about bucking, calm, measuring, already 3 moves ahead. Notice something here, because this wasn't the first time John Wayne had stared down a threat, and the way he was standing told you everything about what he'd learned from the others. His weight was on his back foot, his hands stayed loose at his sides, and his eyes never left Cullaro's face, not even to glance at the gun. That kind of control doesn't come from acting classes. The morning had started clean. 6 a.m. call time, high desert location 60 miles east of Los Angeles, and the crew was setting up for the canyon ambush sequence that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the whole picture. John had been in makeup when the assistant director came in with the message. Cullaro wanted a meeting today, back in town, non-negotiable. The 80s hands had been shaking when he delivered it. That told John enough. By 7:30, they'd wrapped what they could and loaded the trucks. By noon, John was back in Los Angeles, still in costume, walking into a building where the air conditioning was too cold and the carpet was too thick, and men in ties made decisions about other men's work without ever touching a camera. The conference room smelled like old cigar smoke and furniture, polish. Cullaro had arrived 10 minutes late with 2 men John didn't recognize, both wearing dark suits that fit too well to be off the rack. They'd positioned themselves by the door, hands clasped in front of them, faces blank. John had seen that look before, not in Hollywood but in other rooms, other cities, back when he was younger and less careful about whose money he took. Look at what happened in the first 5 minutes, because that's when you could see the whole thing taking shape. Cullaro had started reasonable, sat down, offered John a drink, talked about the weather and box office numbers and how much he believed in this picture. Then he'd shifted, started asking about the script changes he'd requested, the ones that would have turned the lead character from a man with a code into just another gun for hire. John had said no to those changes 2 weeks ago. Said it polite but final. Cullaro had smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes, and asked if John had thought it over. John said he had. Said the answer was still no. That's when Cullaro stood up, reached into his jacket, and put the gun on the table. The youngest producer, a kid named Marsh, who'd only been with Continental for 8 months, made a sound in his throat like he'd swallowed wrong. The lawyer shifted in his chair but didn't get up. The studio's head of production, an old-timer named Bernstein who'd been making pictures since before sound, just stared at the weapon like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. "Let me clarify the situation," Cullaro said, still leaning on the desk. "I've got $230,000 in this picture. My money. Not the studios, not the banks. Mine. And I've got distribution commitments in 6 territories that depend on this film delivering what I promised. You understand what I'm saying?" John understood. He understood that Cullaro was the kind of man who thought fear and respect were the same thing. He understood that putting a gun on a table in front of witnesses meant Cullaro either didn't care about consequences or was so certain of his position that consequences didn't matter. And he understood that every person in this room was doing the same calculation right now, figuring out which side of this they needed to be on when it was over. "I understand you're concerned about your investment," John said. His voice came out level, almost conversational. "That's reasonable." "Reasonable." Cullaro laughed, short and sharp. "You know what's not reasonable? Losing $250,000 because some actor thinks he's a writer." "Wait, because this is where it gets interesting. And if you don't understand what was actually happening under the surface, the next part won't make sense. See, everyone in that room assumed this was about money and control. They assumed Cullaro wanted his investment protected and John wanted creative freedom, and eventually somebody would compromise and they'd all walk out and finish the picture. But John Wayne had recognized something the moment those 2 men in dark suits took their positions by the door. He'd recognized the setup. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a test. Cullaro needed to know if John could be controlled. Needed to know if putting pressure on him, real pressure, the kind that came with actual consequences, would make him fold. Because if John folded here, in front of witnesses, then Cullaro would own him for the rest of the shoot. Every decision, every scene, every line reading would go through Cullaro first. And after this picture, word would spread. Everyone would know that John Wayne could be backed down if he pushed hard enough. The alternative was worse for everybody. If John pushed back, if he made Cullaro lose face in front of his own money and the studio people, then one of 2 things happened. Either Cullaro pulled his funding and the picture died right here, right now, putting 200 people out of work and killing Continental's entire winter release schedule. Or Cullaro did something nobody could walk back from, and then there'd be lawyers and police and depositions and the kind of scandal that burned everything it touched. John looked at the gun, looked at it for the first time since Cullaro had put it down. A Colt Detective Special nickel-plated short barrel. The kind of piece a man carries when he wants it seen. Then he looked back at Cullaro. "You bring that to make a point?" John asked. "I bring it because I don't go anywhere without it." Cullaro straightened up slightly, rolling his shoulders back. "Chicago taught me that much." "Chicago." John nodded slowly like he was considering something. "You know what Chicago didn't teach you." The room got quieter. Bernstein had stopped moving entirely, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. Marsh looked like he wanted to leave but couldn't figure out how to make his legs work. The lawyer had a pen in his hand and was gripping it hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Remember this, because we're about to see something that doesn't look like much from the outside. But if you'd been in that room, if you'd felt the way the air changed, you'd understand why 3 of those men would still be talking about it 20 years later. John Wayne didn't raise his voice, didn't move toward the desk or away from it. He just stood there in his dusty costume with the afternoon light cutting across his face in bars through the blinds, and he let about 3 seconds of silence build until it was heavy enough to lean on. Then he said, "Chicago didn't teach you that the man who has to show the gun already lost." Cullaro's face changed. Not much. Just a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of an inch of movement in his jaw. But that was enough. John had just called him weak in front of 5 witnesses and they both knew it. "You threatening me?" Cullaro's voice had dropped. Lower, gotten quieter. "No, sir." John shook his head once. "I'm explaining how this ends. Stop for a second and picture what's happening from Bernstein's angle, because he's the one who understood it first. Bernstein had been in this business for 30 years. He'd seen labor disputes turn into riots. He'd seen stars walk off pictures over billing. He'd seen directors punch producers and producers blacklist writers and enough backstabbing to fill a warehouse. But he'd never seen anything quite like what John Wayne was doing right now. John wasn't backing down, and he wasn't escalating. He was doing something more dangerous. He was reframing the entire situation in a way that made Cullaro's power move look desperate instead of strong. The gun sat there on the desk between them. Nobody had touched it. Nobody was going to. "How it ends," Cullaro repeated. "All right, Wayne. Educate me." John glanced at the 2 men by the door, then back at Cullaro. "You pull that funding. Continental loses its Christmas release and about 40 jobs disappear overnight. You know that. I know that. But here's what you don't know. I've got 3 other studios that want me for January starts, and 2 of them are offering points on the back end. I walk away from this. I'm working again inside a week." He paused, let that sink in. "You walk away from this. You're the man who killed a John Wayne picture over creative differences. And everyone from here to New York knows you pulled a gun in a business meeting to do it." The lawyer made a small noise. Might have been agreement, might have been shock. Hard to tell. Cullaro's breathing had changed. The anger was still there, but something else was underneath it now. He was calculating, trying to figure out if John was bluffing about those other offers, trying to weigh the cost of losing face against the cost of losing money, trying to decide if the men by the door were enough insurance, if this turned physical. Listen to what John did next, because this is the part that made it permanent. He took 1 step to the side, not closer to the desk, but at an angle, and he hooked his thumbs in his gun belt, the costume one, the same rig he'd been wearing in front of the cameras all morning. It was a tiny movement, barely noticeable, but it changed his silhouette. Made him look exactly like the character he played on screen. The man who didn't bend. The man who couldn't be bought or scared or moved. "I'm not trying to disrespect you, Vincent." John's voice had softened just slightly, enough to sound reasonable without sounding weak. "I know you put real money in this picture. I know you've got commitments. But here's the thing about commitments. They go both ways. I committed to making this picture the right way, the way it was written, the way it was sold, and I'm going to keep that commitment whether you're in the room or not. That was it. 7 sentences, maybe 90 seconds of talking, and the entire structure of the confrontation had flipped. Cullaro was no longer the man holding all the power because he held the money. He was now the man who'd overplayed his hand, and everyone in the room could see it. Before we go on, you need to understand something about the business side of this. Something John Wayne had learned the hard way back in the early 40s when he'd been younger and hungrier and hadn't yet figured out how the game really worked. Studios could control you with contracts, but they couldn't make you care. Backers could threaten you with money, but they couldn't make you compromise if you were willing to walk. The only real power anyone had in Hollywood was the power you gave them by being afraid of losing what you had. And John Wayne, standing there in that conference room with a loaded gun 10 feet away, wasn't afraid. Cullaro picked up the revolver, did it slow, deliberate, like he was making a point, slipped it back into his jacket. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Still hard, but the edge was different now. More business, less threat. 3 weeks to wrap, he said. Not a day longer. Not another dime over budget. And you give me 2 publicity appearances in New York before release. John nodded once. 3 weeks, current budget, 1 appearance. 2. 1. But I'll do radio spots in 5 markets. Cullaro studied him for a long moment, then looked at Bernstein. This is how all your actors negotiate. Bernstein had found his voice again, though it came out careful. Just this one. The tension in the room didn't break so much as it shifted, like a fever finally starting to cool. Cullaro's men by the door relaxed slightly. Marsh put his coffee cup down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The lawyer set down his pen and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. But notice this detail, because it mattered later. When Cullaro walked toward the door, he had to pass close to John. And as he did, he stopped, turned, looked John Wayne right in the face from about 2 feet away, close enough that John could smell the pomade in his hair and see the old knife scar that ran along his jawline under the powder. You got spine, Cullaro said quietly. I'll give you that, but don't think this makes us friends. Didn't cross my mind, John said. Cullaro left with his men. The door closed. For about 5 seconds, nobody in the room moved. Then Bernstein let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it since Cullaro first reached for his jacket. Jesus Christ, John! Bernstein's hands were shaking when he set down his coffee cup. Jesus Christ! The lawyer stood up on legs that looked uncertain. I should probably make some notes about what just happened here. For legal purposes. You should probably forget what just happened here, John said. For everyone's purposes. Marsh, the young producer, had finally found his voice. Did that really just happen? Did he really pull a gun in a studio meeting? He put it on the table, Bernstein corrected. He didn't pull it. Like the distinction mattered. Like any of them had seen it coming. John walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot 5 floors below. Cullaro was crossing toward a black Lincoln, his 2 men flanking him. The sun was lower now, stretching shadows across the asphalt, and somewhere in the distance you could hear a siren. Police or ambulance, hard to say which. Here's what nobody in that room asked, but they were all thinking it. What would have happened if John had backed down? If he'd agreed to the script changes, given Cullaro what he wanted, kept his head down and finished the picture the easy way? The answer was simple, and John had learned it a long time ago. You back down once for the wrong reason, and you spend the rest of your career backing down. Every director who wants a different ending, every studio that wants a safer choice, every money man who thinks he knows better than the people actually making the film, they all remember, and they all come at you the same way, expecting the same result. Cullaro hadn't been testing the script, he'd been testing John. And if John had failed that test, the next 20 years of his career would have been different. Bernstein joined him at the window. The old producer's hands had stopped shaking, but his voice still sounded thin. You really got 3 studios lined up? Nope. John didn't look at him. Got one, and it's a maybe. Christ. Bernstein laughed, but it came out wrong too high. You just bet the whole thing on a bluff. Wasn't a bluff. Cullaro was never going to pull that trigger. Not here, not with witnesses, not over a movie. He needed to know if he could control me. Now he knows he can't. So he'll either stay or walk, but either way, he won't try this again. And if he walks, then we find other money. John turned from the window, looked at the desk where the gun had been sitting 10 minutes ago. There was a small mark on the wood where the barrel had rested, a tiny impression in the finish. There's always other money, but there's only one of these pictures. And I'm not making it wrong just because some Chicago money man thinks he bought more than he paid for. The shoot wrapped in 21 days, came in $8,000 over budget. Close enough that nobody complained. Cullaro showed up once more on the last day of filming, watched them shoot the final scene without saying a word, then left before the wrap party. He never requested another script change, never pulled another power move. And when the picture came out the following spring, it made back its investment in the first 3 weeks and turned Cullaro's stake into something worth talking about. But here's the part nobody saw coming. The detail that makes the whole story land different when you know it. 5 years later, Cullaro backed another Western. Bigger budget, major release, A-list director. And when they started talking about casting, Cullaro had one requirement. He wanted John Wayne. Not as a negotiation, not as a suggestion, as the only acceptable choice. The director asked why. Asked if they'd worked together before. Cullaro had smiled. And the assistant director who was in that room swore. Later, it was the first time he'd ever seen the man smile like he meant it. And Cullaro had said, because he's the only actor I've met who I know won't waste my money. They never talked about the gun, never mentioned that afternoon in the Continental Pictures conference room. But every time they worked together after that, Cullaro would shake John's hand at the start of the shoot and say the same thing. 3 weeks, budget, don't make me regret this. And John would nod and say, wouldn't dream of it. Look back at that meeting one more time because there's something you need to see that only makes sense now. When Cullaro put the gun on the table, he was offering John Wayne a choice. And it wasn't the choice it looked like. It wasn't do what I say or else. It was show me who you really are when everything's on the line. And John, standing there in his dusty costume with 15 seconds to decide, had shown him. Not by being tough, not by matching threat with threat, but by understanding that the only real power in that room was the power to walk away from something that wasn't worth keeping. The mark on the desk stayed there for years. Bernstein never refinished it. Sometimes, when negotiations got heated in that conference room, when some hotshot producer or money man would start making demands and throwing weight around, Bernstein would tap that little impression with his finger and tell the story. Not all of it. Never mentioned the gun. But he talked about the day John Wayne walked in off a set and taught a Chicago money man how Hollywood actually worked. And the people who heard that story would nod and understand because they'd all been in rooms where the person with the most power was the person who needed it least. The picture was called Canyon Justice. It's not John Wayne's most famous film, not the one people remember first when they talk about his career, but it's the one that proved something important to the studios, to the backers, to everyone who thought they could control a man by controlling his options. You can threaten a man's money. You can threaten his career. You can even put a gun on the table in front of him. But you can't threaten a man who's already decided what he won't do, no matter what it costs. That knowledge changed everything. Not just for John Wayne, but for every actor who came after him who had to stand in a room and decide whether to bend or break. Because now they had a story to point to. A real moment when the choice got made and the man who made it walked out standing up. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to hear about the night a different kind of threat showed up, the kind that didn't come with a gun but somehow felt even more dangerous, tell me in the comments, because that story's waiting, and it'll change how you think about courage all over again.